Titans of Mediation, an interview with Dr. Bernie Meyer and Dr. Jaqueline Font-Guzman, part of the series Manousso Musing with seasoned mediator trainer Dr. Barbara Sunderland Manousso. That is our topic for today.
Welcome to the Lawyers and Mediators International Show and Podcast by InstantMediations.com, where we discuss law and conflict resolution topics to educate both professionals and everyday people. Catch regular episodes on YouTube, the Instant Mediations app, and anywhere you get your podcasts. Just remember, nothing in these episodes constitutes legal advice, so be sure to talk to a lawyer, as cases are fact-dependent.
Hey everyone, Mac Pierre-Louis here, attorney, mediator, and arbitrator working throughout Houston, Texas, and Florida.
And Natalia, Ołowska-Czajka, advocate, mediator, and arbitrator from Warsaw, Poland, today from Houston, Texas.
And I'm Dr. Barbara Sunderland Manousso, based in Houston, Texas, and Newport, Rhode Island, a trainer and mediator and arbitrator. And I'm just thrilled today to have the talent of the doctors Bernie Meyer and Jaqueline Font-Guzman. They've just written the book together, The Neutrality Trap. And they are bringing something very strong because within their book, they have created dialogue and they've created a tension that helps dissipate tension. And I'm so excited. Dr. Bernie Meyer, he is the professor emeritus at the Creighton University. He has been over 35 years writing books, training people worldwide in mediation, and working as a consultant, providing programs and training. And then Dr. Jaqueline Font-Guzman, she serves as the inaugural executive director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Eastern Mennonite University. And she's a tenured professor at the Center for Justice and Peace Building. And she has been a Fulbright scholar. So you're going to talk a little bit about your background and what brought the two of you together to write this book. So Dr. Font-Guzman, would you start us off a little bit about what compelled you and inspired you to work with Dr. Meyer? You're both titans of the mediation and conflict resolution community, and the two of you together is very exciting. So please share about the Neutrality Trap.
Well, thank you, Barbara. It's really it's great to be here with all of you. So thank you so much for inviting us. Bernie and I, we met for the very first time at Creighton University. We actually started, I think, within 24 hours of each other and at work at Creighton way back in the days when they were inaugurating the Warner Institute. And so that's how we met. I knew him through his work before, right? I had read some of his book, but I had never met him. And we just developed this friendship. We've been great colleagues. We have had each other's back. We have joined forces to make change happen. We have supported each other through work challenges, family challenges, just about everything. And so when Bernie reached out and we had been sharing each other's work, I was writing at the time a proposal for a book on social activism around Puerto Rico, and he was thinking about doing a second edition of Beyond Neutrality. And then one day he just reached out and made a phone call and said, I don't need a second edition of Beyond Neutrality. I need a whole new book, and I would love it if you write it with me. And obviously I was honored and also very excited of the possibility of taking our relationship in terms of collaborating with each other at another level. We had always read each other's work and commented on it, but this was the first time we would actually be writing something together in that way. So that's kind of how the journey began.
Very nice.
I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, thank you again for having us on. I appreciate that. And I would say that some of the ideas in the book are issues that we had talked about with each other. And I think the fundamental challenge this book addresses is core to the work we do as conflict interveners and peacemakers, which is how do you both help people come together in a constructive way while you also realize that political action, which is often disruptive in nature, needs to be promoted for real social change to occur.
Mac, you had some conversation earlier. Would you share that, please?
So yeah, before we came on there, we were just chatting real quick about a recent documentary we were watching on the life of the former Alabama governor, George Wallace. And, as many people know, he was a big firebrand back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and he was a segregationist. And a lot of really bad things happened during that time, but it got us thinking while we're watching this 4-hour, part mini series on his life, taking us from his early days all the way to his redemption, where he basically admitted that all the wrongs he had done. It made us think about some of the points that you raised in your book, and that is when you have a power imbalance between a perpetrator or somebody in power, in authority, and somebody who's a victim or a group who's a victim. How do you, as a mediator, go about trying to help people, reach consensus and build bridges and see, solutions to a problem from the same kind of point of view? How do you do that when there's such a disparity in power? And that's kind of what I wanted to, ask about, because I also see the same kind of thing when you talk about family violence or sexual exploitation in the workplace, those kind of things. Can you speak a little bit to that, focusing a little bit more on the racial issues that had come up in what we just watched?
So it's a big question. Let me just say, I was very involved in the civil rights movement. And some of the stuff that I was involved with was in direct response to some of the horrendous segregationist, violent suppression of demonstrations that Governor Wallace was responsible for, including this in Selma, Alabama. I was arrested, in fact, in a support demonstration in the North at that time.
Good for you.
So I'm glad that he, to some extent, recanted. I'm not sure he ever fully got it or embraced the harm that he did. But, I'd rather he do that than not do that. But redemption takes a lot more than just saying things like that. Redemption really takes action, struggle, going through some pain, confronting your victims, dealing with them, things that I'm not willing to just so easily say, oh, great, he did that, good for him. So I don't mean to be vindictive, but I do think it's important, if we look at stuff like that, to not say, all you have to do is apologize and all is forgiven. Although I do believe in forgiveness. But it takes work. Both genuine forgiveness takes work, genuine apologies takes work, and it doesn't just take verbal work. Often it takes action. I'm not sure if that's an answer to your question, but I guess I will tie it into some of the themes in our book, if I can, which is that, we've both been involved in a variety of ways with restorative justice programs. And restorative justice programs are really important and valuable, and that is something that could have happened, I suppose, if George Wallace had lived long enough and he was willing to do it, which I have my doubts about. But restorative justice, independent of really looking at changing the systems that created the problem to begin with, can in fact just be a way of perpetuating the problem. And I remember being in South Africa after the Truth and Reconciliation process there was going on. And that was a very important thing to happen, and it allowed some things to go forward. But there were some real flaws in it too that I was on some level aware of, but it really took me having some pretty serious discussions with people who been imprisoned on Robben Island with Nelson Mandela to get, which was, Yeah, people would get up in front of these things and they would apologize and they would take ownership, and then they would go back to their rich mansions, and their victims would go on working for them at minimum wage and in terrible living conditions. There's got to really restorative justice has to also understand if it's not really connecting to real efforts to change systems, it can be a problem too. So that's one of the themes I think we've tried to understand and work through in our book.
I think another thing to add to that is that, I mean, acknowledging the harm also means the willingness to engage in some sort of reparation. That just saying, I'm sorry, I did this, or I get it, I don't think that is enough. I think that you've caused some harm intentionally or unintentionally, then there has to be some sort of reparation. You have to get those group of people or individuals who have been on that receiving end. You have to be able to have the willingness to publicly acknowledge it and then do something about it. And the example here, for example, of slavery, right? We have to recognize that people who were enslaved did never had an equal chance or even a chance to, the system would not allow them to be in similar positions. And it is the disempowerment that has caused and the real impact that has on people's life today on things like not being able to purchase a home, which is one of the best ways you can get assets and build money and then be able to pass it on to next generations, for example, was never an option for enslaved people way back. And so there's some serious consequences that are still happening today. And I think we need to be able to look at that history, acknowledge it, name it, and then what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do to be able to advance individuals so that they are in an equal position then? And so I think when I think about that, I think about, yes, it means about decentering your privilege. It means about recognizing it, but that you really it needs to lead to action. It needs to disrupt enough so that people can connect with each other to the extent that they want to then move the system and change it in ways that are more equitable for everyone.
I admire both of you for speaking the unspoken in your book. And I think one of my biggest takeaways from the Neutrality Trap that you've just co-authored together is that not as the neutral, to not be afraid to name and label and explain and talk about what is actually happening, not pretending that it's too polite or doesn't feel comfortable to say. And mediators need to be comfortable in conflict. And you've taken it one more step, not only comfortable, but to help the parties really name and understand what it is better and deeper, what they're feeling. Do you want to expand on that a little bit, on how you have brought that through and throughout your book? That's wonderful. That's a very strong aspect of your takeaway from the Neutrality Trap. Bernie or Jackie, who would like to address that? Or maybe we can put that on the shelf for a minute.
No.
Natalie seems to have a question that she wants to ask. So if you want to.
We can at least, let me at least briefly say, I think our commitment was to speak our truth as best we could. And it's our commitment when we work with people elsewhere, when we work with, whether it's as coaches or as mediators or facilitators, it is to help other people speak their truth. And that means we have to do our best to do it. And, the biggest obstacle sometimes is to be honest with ourselves about what our real truths are. Because they're not always comfortable for ourselves. They don't always make our lives easier. So we've tried to do it. I'm not going to claim that we're successful. We sure try.
Right. I think part of it, and that comes with the willingness to be vulnerable and the willingness to grapple with what that means, that you could potentially get it wrong, that you could potentially harm someone unintentionally, that you don't know what path you're going down, I mean, which path you're taking, and that we need to be able to be okay with that. So I think one of the agreements we sort of, when we started writing this book, was that we were going to speak our truth, and that we knew that that would mean that there would be a certain section of the population or group of people that may not read our book, right? We hope they do, but we weren't trying to be following the neutrality trap. That we were going to speak from our truth, that we were going to speak what we thought was best, and also based on our own experiences. Not trying to live other people's experiences, but speak from our own experiences. And what did that mean for us, which resonate with some people or maybe not with others. But I think we were okay with that. We were okay with speaking that truth.
And maybe I'll just add one other thing. We had to speak to each other. We had to say things to each other that, when we had differences, we had to work them through and not hold our punches on that. And I think we did it. There weren't any major disagreements, but there were some. And I think I'd like to think we did a pretty good job of that. That's part of the journey.
So I always like that when we first started our very first meeting, actually, this just came to me. I don't know if you remember, Bernie, but the very first meeting was, how are we going to work together? And we had worked together for over 15 years. So it wasn't like we didn't know each other. But I think that opened the conversation as like, how are we going to work together for this project, right? And what does that mean? And that was helpful, right? Because of course there were issues that maybe were disagreements or emphasis on things that we wanted to do more than other. But we worked it out. And I think starting there helped a lot.
And then the question comes, your book, apart from just stating that it is the Neutrality Trap, was also like a second title that comes with a smaller block capital letters. And this is Disrupting and Connecting for Social Change. And when I see it, and then knowing what the book brings, I really want to touch briefly on the fact that it is important how you embrace the change you are trying to inspire people to go through or to start. But then I also understand this factor. We all say we don't like changes, but you embrace something that is important why we don't like them, because they are disruptive. They cause a change in the environment we live in that makes us feel really uncomfortable, actually fearful that we will not come to the second part of your second title of the book, meaning to connecting. What would be your simple advice, not covering everything that the book covers, how to persuade people that this disrupting in the change can bring to connecting in a better way? What can be encouraging to do that, to go through this absolutely painful process?
Jackie, why don't you start on this one?
I will start on this one. You need both disruption and you need connection. And I remember, I think it was Merton who said that rain was actually revolutionary because it impacted and it altered your day-to-day life, right? So something as simple as rain could be disruptive. And so you need to be able to disrupt for the establishment and the institutions or the system that you want to change. It could be a family system, it could be an organization. You need to be able to disrupt. But you also need to be able to hold that tension and connect with other people as you're doing the disruption. Otherwise, it just becomes disruption for the sake of disruption. And there's no strategy behind it, right? We disrupt, but if we don't have a strategy behind it as to what's next, then that's not useful for change either. And so what we do with the book is holding that tension of disrupting and connecting constantly. And we talk a little bit about chaos, the chaotic strategy versus strategic disruption, right? Are we just going to do the chaos and leave it at that, or do we want to be strategic about what are the next steps and how we move forward? And so I think that's the tension that the book is holding throughout, that you can't just jump to dialogue and conversation and pretend everything's okay and say I'm sorry, because that may solve an individual problem, but the systemic issues behind it, the root of the problem, what is really causing the oppression and the inequity, will continue to be there. And so that's not going to be a lot of change moving forward. And I think that's the subtitle is about disrupting and connecting, that we need both to change, and that many times our field, but if you think about lawyers, if you think about journalists, if you think about other professions, because we are too focused on being neutral and being objective and trying to remove ourselves a little bit from those who we are serving, that we tend to go more directly towards the dialogue and conversation, and then we don't keep pushing towards what is next.
Let me just add one thing to this, which is one example of this is the power of nonviolence, nonviolent approaches to social change. Because if you think about it, one of the principles I always liked from I actually got into doing conflict work by teaching nonviolent strategies to activists around a nuclear weapons plant in Colorado. I think one of the principles of nonviolence I always liked is that you should treat every adversary as a potential ally. If you have that kind of idea, even if that's not going to happen, that it could happen in mind, I think that helps. And what I believe is very effective about powerful approaches to nonviolent movements is they are both efforts to be really genuinely disruptive, but they also open the door for future connection or for connection along the way. Now, it's important. Jackie talked about chaotic and strategic approaches to disruption. A lot of times the initial response to something like George Floyd's murder is that it was very chaotic. It was very all over the place. You didn't know what was happening. There was some little violence, not major, around the edges of it. And that's understandable. And that gets the attention, and that's disruptive. That is a form of disruption, but it's not sustainable. And it isn't a strategy for long-term change. It may be that it marshals energy, it creates attention, and it creates what's needed for the next step. But a nonviolent approach to social change it has both a strategy for disruption and a strategy for connection, and they're integrated.
Well, this has been a wonderful dialogue, and the Neutrality Trap was interesting the way you've written it. You have a challenging dialogue with each other as you address some of the chapters and some of the information. And you've brought quite a few takeaways to the mediation and conflict management field. I think everybody should have that opportunity to enjoy reading your book. And I want to thank Mac and Natalia for assisting with some of the great questions today. And most of all, give a lot of applause and thank you to Dr. Bernie Meyer and Dr. Jaqueline Font-Guzman. Absolutely outstanding book, and it's a game changer, I believe, for the mediation community, for mediators, the way they think about themselves as a third-party neutral, and also the role that the mediator has, not just in a room with two people, but their responsibility for looking at social change on a larger scale. So I applaud you both for taking this step and bringing this forth in the Neutrality Trap. Mac or Natalia, any?
Well, yeah, thank you for just adding to the broader knowledge of different ways to approach conflict resolution. It's not just two people at a table, fighting it out over a car accident. It also involves so many other things that connect to our lives and our broader society. So I've learned a lot.
Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate the opportunity and your really interesting inquiry into what we're trying to do with the book.
Yep. Thank you very much for having us. It's been a real pleasure to have this conversation with all of you.
All right, guys. Until next time, we'll be back with another great guest with Dr. Barbara Sunderland Manousso. And check everything out on the Instant Mediations app. Until next time.